Number 7. Rhett Carty Shaw and Kaoru Mori Akiro. When 17-year-old Kaoru Mori Akiro discovered that her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Rhett Carty Shaw, also 17, was still seeing his ex behind her back, she began pushing him to prove his loyalty. Akiro stated she felt humiliated and betrayed, and the only solution would be to get rid of his ex. In May 2019, Carty Shaw visited his former lover, Iman Nasir, in her house in Openshaw, Greater Manchester, England. The young woman had just given birth to their child only 2 months before. After having been intimate with Nasir, Carty Shaw pulled out a knife and stabbed her repeatedly in the face and neck, while also beating her savagely. Meanwhile, Akiro kept control of the situation from afar, texting her boyfriend over 50 times, demanding he filmed the attack. He left Nasir for dead, letting his girlfriend know that he had gone through with their plan, stating, "I did it to prove I love you." Nasir somehow survived the attack and had to be hospitalized for 4 days, while requiring multiple surgeries. She testified against the pair in court, explaining the injuries made it impossible for her to pick up her own baby, and talking about the emotional and physical damage the attack had caused her. On December the 20th, 2019, Carty Shaw and Mori Akiro were each convicted to 16 years in prison for attempted murder and intentionally assisting a person to commit murder, respectively. Number 6. Julio Garay. On July the 14th, 2020, Julio Garay ambushed and murdered his estranged wife on her way to a doctor's appointment in Camarena Health Center in Madera, California. Callie Jean Garay had recently gotten a restraining order against her husband. It was after 7 long years of abuse, being subjected to attacks with screwdrivers, fire pokers, chainsaw blades, and any other household object at hand, that she finally escaped the marriage along with their 3 kids, with only $19 in her pocket. On the day of the murder, Garay approached Callie Jean and their 3 children and started shooting at them before they could find refuge. She died at the scene, trying to keep the boys from harm, using her body as a shield. Dale Blear, the case's preceding judge, referred to the defendant as a self-absorbed narcissist who appeared laser-focused on destroying everything that was important to Callie. 50-year-old Garay was found guilty of first-degree murder and 3 counts of child abuse on November 17th, 2021. Given the charges, the only possible sentence was life without the possibility of parole. Soon after the trial, California passed Callie's Law, meant to ensure victims of domestic abuse are granted the same protection rights that could have saved the mother of 3's life. Number 5. Jessica Smith. 40-year-old mother of 2 Jessica Smith showed no regrets while addressing the court, accused of murdering her toddler and harming her 13-year-old daughter. On August 17, 2016, Smith and her husband had been involved in a custody dispute back in 2014 when the attack took place. The family court judge had ordered a 1-day visitation regime in favor of the father, but Jessica refused to give the children over to her ex, taking them to a motel in Cannon Beach, Oregon instead. Smith claimed her kids were terrified of their father and that her daughter, Alana, told her she'd rather be dead than live with him. On July 31st, 2014, Smith attacked both her own children, with only Alana surviving the ordeal. When police finally caught up with Smith, they found that she had been living out of her car and was trying to starve herself. It took 2 more years for her to be convicted for her crimes. She opted to enter an Alford plea, in which the defendant maintains their innocence while admitting that there is enough evidence to find them guilty. Smith was sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility after 40 years served. Number 4. Kyle Overmeyer. Former Sandusky County Sheriff Kyle Overmeyer was branded a narcissist by Judge Patricia Cosgrove, who officiated over his 2016 trial. Overmeyer was accused of taking advantage of his office for his own benefit, using public funds to finance family vacations, meals, and his own re-election campaign. He also had developed an addiction to painkillers, and though he was prescribed over 1,000 pills over a 2-year period, he still tried to find illegal ways to feed his needs. Overmeyer began to steal discarded drug take-back boxes from 4 different police departments under his command. Of the 43 charges he was indicted with, he pleaded guilty to 13 felony counts. On November 22, 2016, Overmyer sobbed as he admitted to his crimes, asking to be allowed to go into rehab in lieu of a stricter sentence. Judge Cosgrove didn't believe his remorse and rejected his plea for mercy. As well as being sentenced to 4 years in prison, Overmyer was forced to use his state retirement pension to pay the state a restitution of $24,000. Overmyer was released in April 2022, spending the last 180 days of his sentence in a halfway house. Number 3. Ian Stewart. Using what's known in psychology as cognitive distortion, murderer Ian Stewart was able to carry on with his life as usual after assassinating not one, but 2 romantic partners, allowing him to avoid suspicion for over 6 years. On June 25, 2010, Stewart murdered his wife Diana at their home in Basingbourn, England. The death was considered accidental in part due to her husband's 999 call, in which he claimed to have discovered Diana lying unconscious in their back garden. His wife, he explained, had a history of epilepsy. It was only after he drugged and suffocated his new fiancée, acclaimed author Helen Bailey, in 2016 that police took a closer look at Diana's death. Already serving a life sentence for Bailey's assassination, Stewart allegedly asked investigators, "Haven't you got anything better to do?" Though his first wife's body had been cremated, Stewart at the time had decided to donate Diana's brain to science. It had been adequately preserved for 6 years, making an autopsy of the organ possible. The inspection led medical examiners to change the cause of death to prolonged restriction to her breathing from an outside source. Psychologists connected with the case theorized Stewart had narcissistic tendencies and viewed the women in his life as means to an end. The motive behind both murders was monetary. First, the defendant received £100,000 after his wife's death, and he stood to inherit £4 million from Helen's estate. Number 2. The murder of Grace Millane. British marketing graduate Grace Millane went missing in Auckland on December 1, 2018, while backpacking in New Zealand. It was the day before her 22nd birthday, and she had planned to celebrate by going on a date with Jesse Kempson, a man she'd met on Tinder. The family grew concerned after not receiving a response to their happy birthday messages. 2 days after her disappearance, they contacted the Auckland police, who launched an investigation. Her body would be recovered 8 days later, stuffed into a suitcase in a fetal position. Investigators zeroed in on Kempson as their main suspect after discovering a post on her Facebook page and realizing that he was probably the last person to have been in contact with Millane. After being confronted with CCTV videos of himself wheeling the suitcase out of a hotel lobby, Kempson confessed to the murder. He told investigators that he had purchased the bag after the crime and had abandoned it in Waitakere Ranges, a mountainous region west of Auckland. The trial lasted only 3 weeks, and the prosecution called several witnesses to the stand, all of which portrayed Kempson as a narcissistic, compulsive liar who had alienated himself from family and friends, who was obsessed with dating as many women as possible. He had rused Tinder dates into believing he had cancer, had been adopted and neglected as a child, and even that he was friends with several celebrities. Finally, in February 2020, he was convicted to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 17 years. Number 1. Sherry Papini. On November 2, 2016, California resident Sherry Papini disappeared while out jogging. Local authorities contacted the FBI and a search party was assembled. She reappeared 22 days later, 150 miles south of her home, claiming to have been kidnapped by 2 Hispanic men. The mother of 2 seemed to be hurt and in shock as she gave her statement. Authorities, though, noticed inconsistencies in her story, and an investigation led them to discover Papini had run away to live with her ex-boyfriend. Police also found all of her wounds to have been self-inflicted. For 6 years, the investigation continued, with multiple interrogations being conducted by both the police and FBI. Papini maintained her version of events, even after being warned that lying to the FBI was considered a federal offense. She went as far as to apply for monetary benefits and received over $30,000 from the California Victims Compensation Board. Finally, in March 2022, Papini was arrested pleading guilty to mail fraud and making a false statement to federal agents. She claimed to be ashamed of her behavior and issued a public apology, but County Sheriff Michael L. Johnson, who was involved in the investigation from the start, denied this was the case. Johnson called Papini out for her behavior, stating the case was about some very strong narcissistic behavior, along with deception, deceit, and selfishness, and that her confession and supplementary apology was the result of a plea deal offered by the state. Number 7. Nia Stevens. Shortly before 4:30 p.m. on May the 8th of 2019, Wisconsin police pulled over a white SUV that had been speeding near West Arden Place in the village of Butler. Upon approaching the stopped vehicle, an officer reportedly detected the smell of marijuana emanating from inside. He questioned the driver, identified as Nia Stevens, about the odor, at which point she revealed that she'd smoked in the car the previous night. As shown in footage captured by the officer's body cam, Stevens also admitted to not having a driver's license. The 20-year-old was then asked to step out of her vehicle, but she spurned the officer's request and instead sped away from the scene. After crossing both the westbound and eastbound lanes of the roadway, Stevens crashed into a wooden telephone pole. She then got back onto the road and clipped the rear driver's side of the patrol car before fleeing the scene. The collision caused one of the police officers' tires to deflate, thereby disabling the vehicle. Other members of the Butler Police Department were subsequently called in to pursue Stevens, who'd reportedly reached speeds of up to 90 miles per hour during the ensuing 2.5-mile chase. The young woman mounted the sidewalk, ran a red light, and nearly struck another motorist before eventually losing control of her vehicle, which officers found flipped over on the side of the road. Stevens was ordered out of the overturned car at gunpoint. She attempted to flee once again, but was corralled by an officer and placed in handcuffs. In the aftermath, Stevens was charged with attempting to flee or elude an officer, recklessly endangering safety, and resisting an officer. Number 6. Kelly Spadoni. Louisiana woman Kelly Spadoni mistakenly received more than $1 million in her brokerage account with Charles Schwab in early 2021. It later emerged that the 33-year-old, a former 911 dispatcher for the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office, was only supposed to receive an $82 deposit. However, because of a clerical error made by staffers at the financial services company, Spadoni ended up having upwards of $1.2 million erroneously transferred into her account. Officials at Charles Schwab realized that a mistake had been made the following day, and they quickly attempted to reclaim the misdirected funds. They were unable to do so, however, as Spadoni had already transferred the money into a separate account. The woman then allegedly used her mistakenly obtained fortune to purchase a new car and place a down payment on a house. It was at that point that Charles Schwab notified local police of the situation, and Spadoni was consequently ordered to return the money so that it could be distributed appropriately. The Harvey resident refused to obey law enforcement's directive, and she proceeded to ignore phone calls, text messages, and emails from Charles Schwab workers trying to get in touch with her. A warrant was then issued for Spadoni's arrest, and she was ultimately booked into the Jefferson Parish Correctional Center on theft charges. Charles Schwab reportedly filed a federal lawsuit against Spadoni in April of 2021. In it, the financial firm claimed that the woman's account included a clause which made her legally required to return all funds in the event of an overpayment. It was reported that only 75% of the misbegotten money was ever recovered. Number 5. Fabio Cidades. On November the 19th of 2021, Englishman Fabio Cidades was given a suspended 13-month jail sentence for assaulting his ex-girlfriend, whose identity wasn't disclosed by the authorities. The Bishop Auckland resident was also issued a restraining order that prohibited him from making any form of contact with the victim. 10 days later, however, Cidades' former partner watched as an obscured male figure approached the back door of her Newton Aycliffe residence at about 5 p.m. The man, who would be revealed as Cidades, forced his way inside the home and grabbed the woman by the hand to prevent her from fleeing. Her abusive ex-boyfriend's presence reportedly made the victim scream in fear, and she repeatedly told him to leave, but he refused. In a rambling speech which was said to have vacillated between apologetic and erratic, Cidades proceeded to profess his love for the woman and pleaded with her to allow their relationship to resume. The homeowner was ultimately able to call the police, and officers were sent to arrest the man for breaching his restraining order. In the aftermath of her latest encounter with Sedades, the latter's ex-girlfriend began the process of selling her house so that he would no longer know where she lived and therefore be unable to make any more unannounced visits. 22-year-old Sedades was ultimately sentenced to 28 months in prison and was also issued a lifetime restraining order, forbidding any further contact with the victim. Number 4. The Santa Rosa court sting. Law enforcement officials in Santa Rosa, California, organized a sting operation in January of 2017 that targeted motorists suspected of driving with suspended or revoked licenses. On the 31st of the month, undercover police officers were stationed outside of the Sonoma County Courthouse. Between 8 a.m. and 12 p.m., law enforcement staked out individuals who'd been ordered not to drive by a judge or whose licenses had been suspended. In total, 9 people were followed out of the courtroom by officers to ensure that they had means of transportation other than operating a vehicle themselves. 5 of the targeted individuals proceeded to drive themselves from the courthouse in direct defiance of the judge's orders. Each of the offenders was promptly pulled over and arrested by the police. Subsequent reports suggested that the suspects faced the possibility of jail time and longer license suspensions as a consequence of their decisions to disobey their court orders. Number 3. Angie Frost. In March of 2018, police officers in Tulsa, Oklahoma, initiated a traffic stop on a car that had previously been reported stolen. The driver, later named as 36-year-old Angie Frost, pulled over to the side of the road and conformed to the officer's command for her to exit the vehicle. Frost was then arrested on suspicion of stealing the car in question. Subsequent reports indicated that the woman was initially compliant with the policeman who'd taken her into custody without incident. Frost was placed in the driver's seat of one of the squad cars while the officers stood outside chatting with one another. As their conversation continued, one of them noticed that the suspect had somehow managed to slip her cuffs before climbing into the patrol car's driver's seat. She then proceeded to lock the doors and speed away from the scene in the stolen police cruiser. Officers gave chase, and before long, Frost had pulled into the parking lot of a nearby hotel. She abandoned the vehicle and fled on foot, but was quickly caught by the pursuing officers. Frost hadn't directly disobeyed their orders, but the legal limits of her circumstances were implied, considering that she'd stolen the same law enforcement vehicle in which she was being detained. After she was taken back into custody, Frost was charged with possession of a stolen vehicle, larceny of a vehicle, and resisting an officer. In October of 2018, the Tulsa Police Department released dash and body cam footage of the March incident, which rapidly went viral. Number 2. Juris Bredis. 21-year-old pedicab driver Juris Bredis was issued a community protection notice by Greater London's Metropolitan Police after he'd reportedly used his rickshaw in a manner described as antisocial. On January the 7th of 2016, he was arrested again for failing to comply with the protection notice's stipulations, at which point he was given a 5-year criminal behavior order and a conditional discharge. As per the terms of his release, Bredis was restricted from operating his pedicab within certain London area codes. Only 3 days after his release from custody, officers on patrol in Westminster spotted the young man on a pedicab on Bird Street, which was part of the area from which he'd been banned. Bredis attempted to flee from the constables, but he was ultimately caught and arrested again. 2 days later, during a hearing at Westminster Magistrates Court, Bredis was sentenced to 24 weeks in jail for breaching the criminal behavior order. An article published by the news outlet My London detailed how neighborhood policing teams in the Westminster area have partnered with government bodies like Transport for London to crack down on the widespread criminal activity by the city's pedicab operators. Number 1. Simon Pierre Canul. On May the 29th of 2016, Simon Pierre Canul was dining with his partner at a tapas restaurant called La Tapajure in the Canadian city of Sherbrooke. The couple reportedly ordered 4 tapas dishes, including beef tartare, and had made sure to inform their waiter that Canul was severely allergic to seafood. The server allegedly didn't write their order down and also neglected to tell the kitchen staff about the customer's health condition. When the couple's meal arrived a short time later, they'd mistakenly been given salmon tartare on one of their dishes. Due to the darkened lighting in the restaurant, they didn't initially noticed the error. Canule proceeded to consume some of the salmon, after which he rapidly fell ill. The epinephrine auto-injector that he normally would have used to counteract the allergic reaction had reportedly fallen out of his pocket in his car. Canule's partner called for an ambulance, but within minutes, the man went in anaphylactic shock and became unresponsive. He was eventually stabilized after being transported to the hospital, but upon being taken off of an epinephrine drip, the following day he went back into shock. The facility staff successfully resuscitated him, at which point he was placed in a medically induced coma. Canule's condition gradually improved until he was finally released from the hospital a few days later. In the wake of the incident, the waiter from Le Tapajou was arrested for his role in triggering Canule's life-threatening reaction, but the authorities ultimately decided not to pursue charges. Canule filed a civil lawsuit against the man, although he claimed that the litigation wasn't about making money, but rather raising awareness about the seriousness of certain food allergies. News of Canule's anaphylactic shock episode and his subsequent decision to sue the server was circulated internationally. Many weren't sympathetic to Canule's cause, however, and instead criticized what was widely regarded as an overreaction to a wrong order. Number 8. Sergei Grigoriev. Russian hunter Sergei Grigoriev had raised a brown bear named Vorochin, or Grumbler, since it was a cub at the suburban plot of land he owned in Ozersk, Chelyabinsk region. Many of those who knew 41-year-old Grigoriev had reportedly told him how dangerous and irresponsible it was to treat the dangerous predator as if it was his pet. Friends and family pleaded with the hunter to get rid of Vorochin after the bear had attacked him in the past, but the hunter wouldn't give him up. Then in December of 2018, relatives went to check up on Grigoriev after he'd been out of contact for a prolonged period of time. He'd last shared tea with a neighbor who subsequently hadn't seen or heard from him anymore. The hunter's relatives went to his property and found the bear wandering freely around the plot and behaving aggressively. A dog that was with the family attacked it, giving them enough time to escape in their car. Vorochin killed the dog within seconds. The authorities were called to the scene and upon their arrival fatally shot the bear. Upon examining the surroundings, they discovered that Vorochin's cage door was open and determined that he had escaped. They found the remains of a dog owned by Grigoriev, which had been killed and eaten by the animal. The authorities eventually came upon the skeletal remains of the hunter himself, who had been gnawed to the bone by Vorochin. Number 7. Arul. An Indonesian teenager, only identified as Arul, took out his pet king cobra in an attempt to take photos with it and post them to his social media in December of 2017. Reports from those who knew Arul suggested that he'd engaged in similarly irresponsible behavior with the snake in the past, even though it hadn't been defanged and was fully capable of delivering its highly potent venom. On December the 11th, a photo that Arul had uploaded to WhatsApp at 9:50 local time was captioned, "Why not smile a little?" It showed the cobra with its hood spread, indicating it was about to strike. Less than 5 minutes later, Arul posted a second photo showing his bloody forearm after the exotic pet had bitten him and described it as between life and death. The teenager tied a shoelace around his forearm to prevent the venom from spreading to the rest of his body and pleaded with his friends to take him to the hospital. Arul was eventually rushed to the emergency room, but treatment failed in preventing his condition from further deteriorating, and he was pronounced dead that same day. Number 6. Justin Minor. In March of 2022, South Carolina woman Callie Waltman suffered devastating injuries after she was attacked by 3 dogs in Abbeville County. The 38-year-old had been walking home from her boyfriend's house in Honea Path, roughly 80 miles from Columbia. 2 pit bulls and a German shepherd charged the woman and began mauling her. They bit on the head with such force that the skin was torn off, exposing her skull. They ripped all the flesh from her arms along with chunks from other body parts. Local farmer Avery Presley, whom had reportedly fended off the same dogs weeks earlier, intervened as Waltman, who had become unconscious, was being eaten alive by them. Presley fired a gun into the air, scaring away 2 of the animals, and then kicked the remaining one, effectively putting an end to the attack. In the aftermath, according to Waltman's sister, her organs started shutting down, and she died 3 times in the ambulance, helicopter, and on the operating table, but ultimately survived the attack. The mauling had miraculously left her without brain damage, but did result in Waltman losing her arms as well as her colon and voice box. Her life-changing injuries required over a dozen surgeries, including skin grafts and close to 200 staples on her head. According to updates from early May of 2022, a GoFundMe in Waltman's name had raised approximately $240,000 of its $300,000 goal. The dog's owner, 36-year-old Justin Minor, had allegedly once claimed that they'd gotten a taste for blood after slaughtering his chickens. In April, the man was released on a $15,000 bond, as his case would be sent to a grand jury. Waltman's sister described dog attack laws in South Carolina as being very lenient. For not properly securing his dangerous pets, Minor faced a penalty of $5,000 or a sentence of 3 years in prison. Number 5. Shirley Farms. Law enforcement in Obion County, Tennessee, responded to a call about a rampaging camel in March of 2022. When deputies arrived at Shirley Farms in Obion, they found 2 unconscious men subsequently identified as 42-year-old Bobby Metheny and Tommy Gunn, aged 67. Law enforcement immediately tried to provide aid to the victims and move them out of the camel's path. As they were in the process of transferring one of the men to the emergency medical services, the camel charged an Obion County Sheriff's Office vehicle. Deputies then decided to put it down, as they deemed it presented a threat to everyone at the scene. In spite of paramedics' attempts to revive them, Metheny and Gunn succumbed to their injuries. The authorities launched an investigation to determine the circumstances under which the attack had occurred and to determine the extent of their owner's culpability. According to News Channel 5 Nashville, Metheny and Gunn had been assisting in recapturing the camel after it had escaped its pen but were cornered by it and fatally stomped to the ground. The petting zoo to which the animal belonged had previously been cited by the U.S. Department of Agriculture for various safety concerns. A 2018 report found that there were no barriers separating the animals, which included camels, llamas, kangaroos, alpacas, and a zebra, from members of the public. Visitors were also reportedly feeding and interacting with the animals only in the presence of a cashier who didn't have a direct line of sight to them. In 2019, the USDA found that the only source of water that the animals had was a shallow, muddy creek that traversed their enclosure. Number 4. Brandy Dowdy. Alabama public health employee Jacqueline Summer Beard, aged 58, was investigating a dog attack at a home along Route 11 in April of 2022. Subsequent reports indicated that Beard was in the process of contacting the owner when she was attacked by a pack consisting of the exact same dogs she'd been sent to investigate. The incident initially went unnoticed and the authorities were called to the area following reports of a suspicious vehicle on Crumpton Road outside of Red Bay. According to a Facebook post by the Franklin County Sheriff's Office, other residents were attacked by the dogs and one of them suffered minor injuries after deputies had already arrived at the scene. The post revealed that some of the aggressive pets had to be put down immediately. Then, as law enforcement began investigating the suspicious vehicle, they came upon Beard's body, and it was evident that she'd been mauled to death. The dog's owner, 39-year-old Brandy Lee Dowdy, was taken into custody and charged with manslaughter. The authorities reported that the victim of the attack that Beard had initially been sent to investigate was still hospitalized in Mississippi at the time of the public health employee's death. Number 3. Sadie Totterdell. In June of 2020, 2 women received a combined jail sentence of 5 years following a fatal dog attack at the Ten Creek Holiday Park in Cornwall, England. The previous April, Sadie Totterdell and Tawny Willis, both aged 28 at the time, were spending time together at the Caravan Park Social Club. The latter's son, Frankie, was left alone with Totterdell's dog, Winston, in an adjacent caravan, in spite of the fact that the pet had been responsible for several attacks in the past. Both women had deemed that Frankie would be safe in its company. In the early hours of the morning, others in the park awoke to Willis screaming, "The dogs attacked my boy!" Frankie was found unresponsive after Winston had viciously mauled him. The boy ultimately succumbed to blood loss and paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene. A post-mortem examination revealed that he'd suffered at least 54 injuries during the attack. In the ensuing legal proceedings, Totterdell was jailed for 3 years after pleading guilty to being the owner of a dog dangerously out of control, and she was banned from owning or controlling a canine for 10 years. Frankie's mother pleaded guilty to neglecting a young person and was given a 2-year prison sentence. Number 2. Tracy Taylor. British woman Laura Holmes and her friend Tracy Taylor were at the latter's Nottingham home in May of 2014. At some point during their meetup, Holmes, then in her early 20s and 7 months pregnant, went upstairs while in the middle of replying to a text message. She was then charged by Taylor's dog, a 9-year-old American Akita named Coda. who brought her to the ground. Holmes struggled to free herself from the dog's jaws as he clamped on her arm and then her leg. Before she eventually managed to get to a bathroom, Coda bit deep into her face, tearing off chunks of flesh from her mouth and cheek. She was rushed to the hospital where surgeons battled to save her face and baby. The child was born unaffected by the incident, but Holmes needed 60 stitches to mend her facial lacerations and was left scarred for life. Taylor surrendered Coda to the authorities in the immediate aftermath and the dog was put down. A day before the May 13th attack, new laws had taken effect according to which dog owners could be taken to court for failure to control their dangerous pets. Taylor received a 16-week jail sentence, suspended for a year, and was ordered to pay Holmes a little over $1,200 in compensation. The latter appeared on Good Morning Britain along with her baby to talk about her ordeal, and she expressed an intention of suing Taylor. Number 1. Kim Carlton. In May of 2007, Tanya Dumstresos was at a farm owned by her fiancé Kim Carlton in British Columbia, Canada. The facility, called Siberian Magic, housed exotic animals that included tigers, a lion, and a lemur. Carlton reportedly put on exotic and magic shows, charging a fee for visitors who wanted their photos taken with the big cats, who were described as his pets. The man wasn't present at the farm when Tanya Dumstresos went to the tiger enclosure, accompanied by her preteen daughter and teenage son. She then petted a tiger named Gangus goodnight, as she was known to routinely do. Gangus reportedly started playing with Tanya Dumstresos's dress and swiped at it, but hit her legs. He was the only tiger at the farm not to have been declawed, and the poor strike severed an artery in the woman's leg. In the aftermath, as she was rapidly losing blood, Dumstresos called Carlton on his cell phone, and the two were able to say that they loved each other. Paramedics arrived at the farm and rushed her to a hospital, but the woman couldn't be revived. An investigator for the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals subsequently described Carlton's farm as a public safety catastrophe. The incident set into motion legislation that made it illegal to own certain exotic animals without a permit. In an ironic twist, Carlton became the first person to be convicted on the new legislation 3 years later, when he was fined $500 for lion cub possession. As reported by CTV News, the authorities were baffled that he'd continued owning dangerous exotic animals, considering his fiancée's tragic death. Number 9. Steve Brown. On the night of January the 21st of 2018, stand-up comic Steve Brown was performing at the Comedy House in Columbia, South Carolina, when he was violently attacked by an enraged member of the audience. In the wake of the incident, the Richland County Sheriff reported that the suspect, identified as Marvin Totley, had taken great offense to something Brown had said during his comedy routine. Eyewitness testimony revealed that Totley vaulted over a table to get onto the stage, at which point he began throwing punches at the comedian, who successfully dodged the attacks. As was captured in a shocking video of the assault, Totley then grabbed the microphone stand and repeatedly swung it at Brown before picking up a wooden stool and tossing it in the comic's direction. Roughly 20 seconds into Totley's onslaught, two people rushed to the stage and positioned themselves between him and Brown. The former was then taken out of the venue by security, and a few days later, he was arrested on charges of third-degree assault and battery and malicious injury to property. Following his performance that night, Brown posted a video to Instagram in which he suggested that comedy clubs should be held accountable for their lack of proper security. Number 8. Taylor Swift. On August the 4th of 2015, Grammy Award-winning singer-songwriter Taylor Swift was performing at the Rexall Place in Edmonton, Canada, as part of the world tour of her 2014 synth-pop album, 1989. While then 25-year-old Swift sang one of the record's hit singles, Bad Blood, she had a frightening and involuntary interaction with a member of the audience. As was captured by concert-goers' cell phone cameras, a man suddenly rushed towards the stage and lunged forward in an attempt to grab Swift's leg. Visibly startled, the pop icon stopped singing and stumbled backwards to avoid the fans' reach. Then a few seconds later, she resumed her performance as if nothing had happened. Although it wasn't shown in the video, which went viral in the incident's aftermath, subsequent reports suggested that the unidentified audience member had been swiftly dealt with by security. Number 7. Esteban Alvarado. During a Dutch Cup match between AZ Alkmaar and Ajax FC on December the 28th of 2011, a young man wearing jeans and a black t-shirt ran onto the pitch and began charging towards Costa Rican goalkeeper Esteban Alvarado. The latter noticed the incoming fan just in time to mount a defense and ended up knocking him to the ground. Alvarado then kicked the 19-year-old pitch invader multiple times while he was lying on the grass. Stewards rushed to the scene and escorted the fan off the field, while Alvarado was subsequently issued a red card for misconduct. In the immediate aftermath, AZ Alkmaar's head coach walked onto the pitch and told his team to go back to their locker room. Representatives from both teams, along with stadium officials, ultimately decided to cancel the match, which was then rescheduled for a later date. The Dutch Football Association eventually rescinded Alvarado's red card, while his unidentified attacker was reportedly jailed for a period of 6 months. Number 6. Slash. British-American musician Saul Hudson, better known by the stage name Slash, rose to prominence in the 1980s and 90s as the lead guitarist for the California hard rock band Guns N' Roses. In 2010, Hudson was playing the solo from one of the group's most famous songs, Sweet Child of Mine, during a concert in the Italian city of Milan. At the height of his performance, he was suddenly charged by a rowdy member of the audience. Subsequent reports described the male fan as having been shirtless, with dried blood splattered around his mouth. He emerged from the side of the stage and launched himself at Hudson. Fortunately, a security guard had already been in pursuit and managed to tackle the man to the ground before he grabbed the guitarist. While Hudson was left unharmed, the neck of his custom-made Gibson guitar was reportedly cracked after the altercation had caused him to drop it. He temporarily left the stage to repair his instrument and ultimately came back to finish the show with the rest of the band. Number 5. Dylan Avila. Entertainer Dylan Avila served as the master of ceremonies for a stand-up comedy show at the local 907 bar and restaurant in Renton, Washington on January the 5th of 2015. According to several eyewitnesses, Avila was about to introduce the next comedian to the stage when an audience member suddenly charged towards him. The man was wielding an aluminium baseball bat, which he proceeded to swing at Avila's head. He was struck twice before fellow comics and other members of the crowd intervened to contain the attacker. Avila was immediately taken to the hospital, where it was determined he'd suffered a double skull fracture. It was reported that he required 2 titanium plates in his head and 20 staples across his skull to repair the damage that had been inflicted by the fan. Although he largely recovered from his traumatic brain injury, doctors told Avila that he would continue to experience lingering effects, including heightened emotions and increased fatigue, for many years. It later emerged that Avila's assault had been carried out by fellow comedian Steve Baldwin, who'd performed at the local 907 on multiple occasions in the past. Many reportedly found Baldwin's comedy routine to be offensive and unfunny, so Avila and the club's owners banned him from performing at the venue. Investigators believe that he targeted Avila as a form of retaliation. Baldwin was arrested on assault charges, while Avila used the ordeal as inspiration for a one-man show called My Turn at Bat. He debuted the performance, which reportedly addressed his horrific bludgeoning in detail at the Rendezvous pub in downtown Seattle on January the 6th of 2018. Number 4. Billy Sharp. Billy Sharp, an English professional footballer and captain of the club Sheffield United, was attacked by a fan who'd run onto the pitch following the EFL Championship semi-final match. On May the 17th of 2022, cameras that were live covering the event captured the incident, which prosecutors would later deem a deliberate and senseless act of violence. Although many members of the crowd had poured onto the pitch after the conclusion of the match, the suspect, later named as Robert Biggs, dodged other spectators as he ran directly towards Sharp. Upon reaching the footballer, 30-year-old Biggs knocked him to the ground by headbutting him in the face. The team captain reportedly required 4 stitches on his lip in the attack's aftermath. In the early hours of the following morning, local police located Biggs and placed him under arrest. He was charged with assault causing actual bodily harm and was consequently jailed for 24 weeks. The judge presiding over the case also ordered that Biggs, who was a season ticket holder for the Nottingham Forest Football Club, be banned from attending any football matches for a period of 10 years. Nottingham Forest indicated that they were issuing Biggs a lifetime ban from any future club events. Number 3. Dave Chappelle. Comedian Dave Chappelle was attacked by an audience member during a live performance at the Hollywood Bowl Amphitheater in Los Angeles on May the 3rd of 2022. The incident occurred at around 10:45 p.m. as Chappelle was nearing the end of his stand-up routine, which was part of the Netflix as a Joke comedy festival. Footage from an audience member's cell phone captured the moment. 23-year-old Isaiah Lee charged the stage and lunged at Chappelle. Moments later, the attacker was tackled to the ground by security and led off the stage. Chappelle was unharmed and subsequently carried on with his performance, while the stage invader, who'd reportedly suffered multiple injuries, was taken to a local hospital. The following day, the LAPD announced that Lee had been arrested on a felony charge of assault with a deadly weapon, as he'd reportedly been carrying a replica handgun with an ejecting knife blade at the time of the attack. Video clips of the incident, as well as Chappelle's comments in its immediate aftermath, went viral on social media. Many praised Chappelle for the poise and professionalism he'd exhibited throughout the threatening situation. Lee, who was reported as suffering from mental health issues, later claimed that he'd been triggered by the comedian's jokes about homeless and transgender people. Number 2. Lester Chambers. Prominent soul singer Lester Chambers performed at the Hayward Russell City Blues Festival in downtown Hayward, California on July the 13th of 2013. At one point during the show, the 73-year-old musician announced that he was dedicating the Curtis Mayfield song People Get Ready to the late Trayvon Martin. The latter was a Florida teenager who'd been gunned down during an altercation with a man named George Zimmerman in 2012. Earlier on the day of Chambers' performance, Zimmerman had been acquitted of second-degree murder charges in connection to Martin's killing. Shortly after the singer's mention of the slain teen, a female member of the audience, identified as Diana Lynn Andrews Potter, loudly exclaimed, "It's all your fault." She then rushed the stage and forcefully shoved the elderly singer. Other musicians sharing the stage with Chambers managed to restrain the woman until she was taken into the custody of Hayward police. Many believe that Andrews Potter's attack had been racially motivated, and Chambers' family therefore pushed for her to be charged with a hate crime. However, the Alameda County District Attorney reportedly found no evidence that racial hostility had played a part in the incident. Andrews Potter was ultimately charged with felony assault and elder abuse as a consequence for the attack, which had left Chambers with bruised rib muscles and nerve damage. Number 1. Ally Brooke. Singer Ally Brooke, one of the founding members of the Miami girl group Fifth Harmony, was assaulted during a live performance in Mexico on the night of September the 29th of 2016. A crazed fan rushed the stage and grabbed 23-year-old Brooke by the hair before attempting to drag her away. Within seconds, a security guard approached the attacker and removed him from the stage. During the encounter, Brooke was knocked to the ground as her bandmates and the thousands of audience members in attendance watched on in complete shock. She then got back up, seemingly unaffected, and even blew a kiss to her attacker before resuming the performance. The incident occurred just 2 days after Brooke had been accosted by a fan at the Monterrey International Airport in Nuevo Leon. An unnamed individual had grabbed the singer shortly after the group had arrived in Mexico and were making their way through a crowd that had gathered to see them in the airport lounge. In the wake of that experience, Brooke had pleaded with Fifth Harmony fans to be careful and gentle so nobody gets hurt. Number 7. Swahili's Pedraza Rodriguez and Melissa Aquino Arias. From August to September of 2017, 2 women were accused of carrying out 3 separate bank robberies, one of which they committed while dressed as nuns. Swahili's Pedraza Rodriguez of New Haven, Connecticut, and Melissa Aquino Arias of the Dominican Republic attempted their first heist on August the 28th when they targeted the branch of Citizens Bank in Tannersville, Pennsylvania. The 2 women, one of whom was armed with a handgun, entered the building while donning nuns' habits and immediately demanded cash from the bank's employees. An alarm was subsequently triggered, prompting the robbers to flee without collecting any money. Rodriguez and Arias then plotted 2 additional robberies, both of which were perpetrated in New Jersey. The first occurred in late September of 2017 at the Spencer Savings Bank in Garfield. The women, dressed in headscarves, successfully robbed the bank while holding the tellers at gunpoint. On October the 15th, they descended on an NVE bank in Teaneck for their final robbery attempt. They initially inquired about opening an account with the bank, but were soon recognized by an employee as the alleged Garfield robbers. The workers contacted the police and the women fled the scene but they were taken in custody later that day. Number 6. Sandeep Kaur. A registered nurse from California performed a string of bank robberies over the course of 2 months in 2014. Following Sandeep Kaur's widely publicized crime spree, the FBI gave her the nickname the Bombshell Bandit. She'd incurred a substantial amount of debt in the years leading up to the robberies. Since November of 2010, Kaur had developed a gambling habit. After traveling to Las Vegas with her cousin for her 21st birthday, she started planning monthly trips to Vegas and subsequently got involved with a variety of moneylenders who bankrolled her worsening addiction. With mortgage payments to make and exorbitant gambling debts to pay off, Kaur's financial situation continued to deteriorate at the beginning of 2014. She ultimately resorted to robbing a bank after a loan shark threatened to hurt her family in the event that she was unable to pay what she owed to them. The first robbery occurred in May of 2014 at a bank in Valencia, when Kaur outfitted herself in a blue tracksuit, a pair of oversized sunglasses and a wig. She handed the teller a note that stated she would detonate a bomb if the worker failed to comply with her demands. Kaur made off with $21,200 during her first heist, which would be a larger sum than those obtained during any of the other 3 robberies to which she'd eventually pleaded guilty. She was finally caught by police in late July of 2014 after robbing a bank in St. George, Utah. She led officers on a high-speed chase that spanned multiple states and ultimately came to a stop in Nevada. Kaur was sentenced to 66 months in prison for her crimes and was also ordered to pay fines that amounted to $250,000. Number 5. Iconic Facey. A woman by the name of Iconic Facey was arrested in connection to a robbery at the Bank Course South branch in Gulfport, Mississippi. In March of 2019, Facey, aged 37, walked into the bank completely unarmed and handed one of the tellers a note demanding cash. She managed to get away with an unspecified amount of money, but the bank's employees were able to provide law enforcement officials with detailed descriptions of the robber during the ensuing investigation. The workers recounted that Facey looked as if she'd recently undergone plastic surgery to her cheeks, as they seemed to have been artificially enhanced in some way. Multiple tellers recognized Facey from a photo lineup shown to them by police, and the woman was consequently arrested at George Bush Intercontinental Airport in Houston, Texas. The suspect had returned to the United States following a brief trip to Mexico, where it's believed she'd used the stolen money to fund further surgical alterations to her face. Authorities learned that Facey had previously robbed an Alabama bank in 2008 and was then convicted under her birth name, Jimmy Maurice Lewis. For that crime, Lewis had served 51 months in federal prison, after which she legally changed her name to Iconic Facey. Following her second robbery, Facey was sentenced to the maximum of 15 years behind bars. Number 4. Samantha Wyatt. The US bank in Dillsboro, Indiana was robbed by a 26-year-old woman from Ohio on November the 25th of 2019. Samantha Wyatt entered the building alone and slipped a note to one of the tellers. It read, "Take everything out of the top and bottom drawer and tell me to have a great day." And she left the bank with an undisclosed amount of money. A few hours later, local police released a picture of the suspect that was taken from the bank's surveillance footage. On Thanksgiving Day, the authorities received an anonymous tip from someone who believed Wyatt to have been the perpetrator of the robbery. Wyatt was brought in for an interview with investigators, during which she claimed not to have left the state of Ohio on the day of the crime. Butler County Sheriff's deputies subsequently executed a search warrant on Wyatt's vehicle and found 3 money bands commonly used by banks to wrap large bundles of cash. It was also revealed that Wyatt had searched for directions to the US bank on the day it was robbed, and she ultimately admitted to the crime on December the 9th. She told the authorities that she'd parked at a nearby church and removed her license plate prior to the robbery. After escaping with the cash, she reattached the plate and drove back to Ohio. She was taken into custody at the Dearborn County Law Enforcement Center and faced felony robbery charges. Number 3. Sarah Crosby. After robbing a bank in Laurel, Delaware, a young woman from North Carolina led police officers on a pursuit across state lines while her 4-year-old son was in the car with her. Sarah Crosby, aged 21, carried out the robbery at the Bank of Delmarva on the morning of June 30th of 2014. She reportedly handed one of the tellers a stick-up note that indicated she was armed, before fleeing with the cash in a white sedan, which was also carrying her young son. She was pursued by officers from multiple Delaware police departments as she made her way down Route 13 towards Maryland. Once the chase crossed into the neighboring state, law enforcement agencies from Maryland became involved in the high-speed pursuit as well. Crosby eventually ran over a set of spike strips that had been planted to intercept her, but continued to drive on her vehicle's rims until officers were able to bring her to a controlled stop on the Salisbury bypass. The weapon used in the robbery was found inside Crosby's car, as was the stolen money. Crosby faced charges in connection to the theft, as well as the ensuing chase, during which she collided with 3 other vehicles, including a Delmar police cruiser. Fortunately, her child wasn't harmed during the incident, and he was taken into protective custody following his mother's arrest. Number 2. Shelby Taylor Wise. After witnessing a woman taking out $75,000 in cash from her account, a bank teller from Houston, Texas, instructed 2 accomplices to target her in a violent robbery. 25-year-old Shelby Taylor Wise was an employee at Wallace State Bank at the time of the incident, which took place on August 17th of 2018. Wise was stationed near the teller window at which a bank patron carried out a cash withdrawal for $75,000. Wise could be seen on the bank's surveillance tapes watching the woman intently as she conducted the transaction with another teller. At the exact moment the customer left the bank with the money, Wise pulled out her cell phone and appeared to send a text message. As police would later discover, the person who'd received the text was Wise's boyfriend, Trayvon Johnson. Wise was orchestrating a plot to rob the woman of the sizable sum of cash she had in her possession, which was meant for her family's gas station and check cashing business. The robbery was executed by Johnson and an accomplice, later identified as Davis Dowell Mitchell. The 2 perpetrators followed the woman to the gas station in Jersey Village and ambushed her. The gas station security cameras captured the ensuing struggle, during which the woman's husband ran out to help her fight off the 2 men. Both victims were badly beaten during the altercation, and Johnson could even be seen backing into them with his car. After the robbers absconded with the cash, the woman and her husband both required hospitalization for their injuries. Law enforcement was quick in tracking down Johnson and Mitchell, from whom they recovered the stolen money. Both men were arrested and charged with aggravated robbery with a deadly weapon. Investigators also discovered that the car Johnson had used during the robbery was registered to a rental car agency and had been leased by Wise, who was also taken into custody and charged with felony robbery. Number 1. Elizabeth Jeannie Holt. Following a violent bank heist that resulted in the robber's death, during a shootout with law enforcement, a woman was arrested for aiding in the execution of the crime and obstructing the ensuing police investigation. The robbery in question took place at the Zions Bank in St. George, Utah, on September the 11th of 2014. Benjamin Schroff, age 37, walked into the bank disguised in a blonde wig and fake beard. While armed with a shotgun and a revolver, he stole an unspecified amount of cash and subsequently took 2 female bank employees hostage. Schroff fled with the money and the 2 hostages in one of their cars and soon became involved in a high-speed chase with officers of the St. George Police Department. Schroff fired multiple rounds at his pursuers, ultimately hitting 3 patrol cars in the process. As the chase continued, local police encountered 38-year-old Elizabeth Jeannie Holt on the side of the road, near where the pursuit was taking place. She claimed to have been feeding the horses at the nearby corral, but officers asked her to leave the area. Schroff eventually jumped out of the stolen vehicle, allowing his 2 hostages to flee to safety. He hid in the weeds and bushes near the Virgin River, and law enforcement officials then released an emergency notification to all nearby residents, who were advised to stay indoors until the fugitive was caught. St. George police were finally able to locate Schroff after multiple hours of searching the area surrounding Washington Fields. A shootout ensued during which the robber was killed. The authorities would later discover that Holt was Schroff's girlfriend and that she'd tried to help him. She was actually near the location of the police chase in order to meet up with the bank robber and facilitate his escape with the money. Investigators also learned that Holt was carrying the same ammunition used by Schroff during the shootout and that she'd sent Schroff's teenage son to bury her rifle in the desert immediately after her first encounter with the police. Holt was charged with 4 counts of obstruction of justice and 1 count of aggravated robbery. She was consequently sentenced to 8 months at a correctional facility and was also ordered to perform 200 hours of community service. Number 7. Brett Chaos Pecci. 34-year-old Brett Pecci, a notorious ex-biker, was taken into custody by Western Australian police on the morning of June the 26th of 2020. He served as a high-ranking member of the Bandidos motorcycle gang for many years, during the course of which he engaged in a variety of criminal activities that led to his arrest on multiple occasions. This particular incident began on June the 24th when Pecci, nicknamed Chaos during his gangster days, threatened 2 officers, issuing him a police order. The order was connected to a domestic violence incident involving his ex-girlfriend, Ricky Louise. Pecci imitated the cocking of a firearm and pretended to point a gun in the policeman's direction. The authorities' concern over the mock threat intensified after a video surfaced in which Pecci said the phrase "coppers die today" with a shotgun placed beside him. Heavily armed tactical response officers subsequently made their way to Pecci's residence to arrest him. They surrounded his property and used a loudspeaker to demand he exit the house. He eventually came outside and gave himself up without incident. A number of charges were handed down, including threatening to kill, possessing a firearm in circumstances of aggravation, and various police order breaches. The whole situation concluded with him being put behind bars for a year. It wasn't the first time Pecci had been arrested in dramatic fashion. In 2018, 26 police officers surrounded his house while he was barricaded inside, videotaping the standoff. Just a few years earlier, the outlaw biker was arrested at Brisbane International Airport over extortion charges after being on the run for 2 years. Number 6. Liam Scorsese. On February the 25th of 2018, a domestic dispute involving a member of the Comanchero Motorcycle Club ultimately led to a deadly police shooting in Brisbane, Australia. 31-year-old biker Liam Scorsese attempted to enter his girlfriend's family residence in a fit of rage after the couple had engaged in a heated argument. He had been locked out of the house and subsequently started banging on the door, shouting for his partner, Shirez Beitel, to come out. Beitel and the rest of her family barricaded themselves inside the home and called the police. When the authorities showed up at the scene, they found Scorsese wielding a knife he had stolen from the kitchen. With the weapon in hand, he began to approach the officers, who instructed him to drop the blade and get on the ground. Scorsese refused to heed their instructions, prompting the police to fire a taser at his chest, which did little to subdue him. Scorsese ripped the taser wires from his body and resumed charging the officers. In fear for his and his partner's lives, one of the policemen brandished his gun and fired 2 shots at the biker, causing him to fall to the ground. The officers administered first aid until an ambulance arrived to transport him to Princess Alexandra Hospital. He passed away from his gunshot wounds an hour later. Beitel complained that the police officers dispatched to her house that day had neglected to turn on their body cameras prior to shooting Scorsese. After an inquest into the incident, a coroner suggested officers be equipped with body cams that are automatically activated once their guns are drawn. Number 5. Dustin Lindner. A man was shot and killed in DuPont, Indiana by a group of 5 bikers belonging to outlaw motorcycle clubs. On June the 22nd of 2021, the victim was 35-year-old Dustin Lindner of Georgetown, Kentucky, who had gotten into an argument with the 5 suspects after wearing the insignias associated with their gangs, the Pagans and the Warlocks, despite the fact that he wasn't a member of either group. The bikers in question were later identified as David Faulkner, Gary Fletcher, Jason Brewer, Michael Carnuth and Jordan Lowe. After confronting Lindner and expressing their displeasure with his tattoos and patches bearing their symbols, they went to his residence in the early morning hours and conducted a home invasion. Police received reports of shots fired shortly thereafter. When officers arrived at the scene, they found Lindner lying in the yard with a gunshot wound. He had been shot dead following an altercation with the 5 bikers, all of whom were apprehended in connection with the incident. Faulkner, Fletcher, Brewer, and Carnuth were each charged with murder, while Lowe received lesser indictments. Number 4. Michael Davey. An associate of the Rebels motorcycle gang was shot dead in a residential driveway in Kingswood, Australia, on March the 30th of 2016. Michael Davey, aged 30, was an enforcer for the infamous outlaw club and had earned himself the nickname Ruthless. He had a criminal history that included a manslaughter conviction in 2002 when he was just 17 years of age. Despite his checkered past, Davey was looking to escape the violent world of which he was a part after his girlfriend had given birth to a son. Just after midnight on the night of his death, Davey told his girlfriend he was meeting a friend across the street from where they lived. When he walked to the neighboring driveway, he was shot and killed by 2 fellow rebel members who fled the scene in a getaway car. Witnesses recounted hearing as many as 6 gunshots, followed by the sound of screeching tires. The shooters had reportedly turned on Davey after word got out that he no longer wanted to be associated with the club. The slain motorcyclist was laid to rest in Western Sydney on April the 8th of 2016. The funeral ceremony was attended by dozens of bikers from all over Australia. In August of 2018, the 2 perpetrators were identified by the authorities and charged with Davey's murder. They were both already in correctional facilities for other offenses when the charges were handed down. Number 3. Jeremy Harris. A 38-year-old Florida man named Jeremy Harris was brutally attacked by a group of angry bikers after accidentally clipping one of their vehicles on January the 9th of 2021. Harris came to an intersection in North Fort Myers that was being blockaded by motorcyclists. He began to berate the stationary bikers for stopping the flow of traffic, just so the rest of their group could skip the red light. Harris then attempted to drive away but came very close to knocking one of the riders off his bike. The bikers then pursued him and surrounded his car at a stoplight. Harris exited his vehicle with a wrench in hand and tried to protect himself, but he was ultimately overpowered by the enraged bikers, who proceeded to viciously beat and bludgeon him with the tool. Horrified onlookers attempted to break up the altercation, but the attackers continued their assault. Harris's skull was fractured during the onslaught and he required 15 stitches in his head. Multiple suspects were arrested following the incident and charged with felony battery. Number 2. Ben Geppert. In September of 2020, an ex-Hells Angel by the name of Ben Geppert invaded the home of a 26-year-old man from Broadbeach Waters, Australia, and attacked him with a baseball bat over a drug dispute. Geppert, age 29, had sold the victim $1,500 worth of illegal substances a month prior to the incident, but he was reportedly only given $1,000 in payment. The biker demanded the money he was owed, but on the other side of the argument, the man claimed the drugs he'd been sold were fake. As he continually refused to pay, Geppert texted him a picture of a gun before arriving at his house and beating him to a pulp in his front yard before the eyes of terrified bystanders. At around 11 p.m. that same night, Geppert returned to the man's residence and broke in, armed with a baseball bat, which he used to club the man's head. The resulting injuries required 12 stitches to mend. The very next day, Geppert returned once again and forced the man to accompany him to get a Rolex watch appraised. The biker was subsequently arrested following a rooftop chase with police officers in the town of Kingscliff. In August of 2021, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison for the home invasion and assault. The charges were added to the extensive list of Geppert's past offenses. He was also featured in our Hells Angel video regarding an incident in which he'd attacked his girlfriend who, fearing for her life, was forced to jump out of a moving car. He also appeared in a viral video produced by the Queensland Police Service, which aimed at stopping new recruits from joining outlawed gangs. Number 1. The 2015 Waco Shootout. A violent shootout between rival motorcycle gangs erupted in Waco, Texas on May the 17th of 2015. More than 200 people were gathered inside a Twin Peaks restaurant for a regional meeting of Texas's statewide biker group coalition. The main topics on the gathering's agenda were centered on political rights for motorcyclists. 18 Waco police officers and 4 Texas state troopers were stationed outside the establishment to monitor the gathering, which had initially started out peacefully. Tensions began to rise between 2 clubs present at the event, the Bandidos and the Cossacks. The incident that reportedly set off the conflict involved someone getting their foot run over in a parking spot just after noon. By 12:24 p.m., the argument had escalated into an all-out gunfight. Patrons of nearby restaurants ducked for cover under tables and behind cars as gunshots started flying from all sides. The police soon returned fire after being shot at themselves, but no civilians or law enforcement officers were wounded during the incident. However, 9 bikers were killed at the scene and 18 others were injured. Police snipers were able to target the armed suspects and bring an end to the gunfire. In the aftermath of the shootout, a total of 177 people were arrested and detained by the authorities. but only one of them was ever brought to trial. Jake Carrizal, president of the Bandidos Dallas chapter, was tried for his involvement in the deadly episode, but his case was ultimately thrown out due to a mistrial. By April of 2019, all of the criminal cases stemming from the Waco shootout had been dismissed. More than 130 civil lawsuits were subsequently filed against various state and local officials by many of the bikers involved in the mass arrest. Number 7. Recep Çetin. In August of 2011, the bodies of 2 Irish women were found buried in shallow graves in the woods outside the popular Turkish resort town of Kuşadası. Subsequent medical examinations determined that the victims, identified as Marion Graham, and her friend Kathy Dinsmore, had been fatally stabbed. During the investigation that followed, local police brought waiter Recep Çetin in for questioning. The latter had been dating Graham's teenage daughter Shannon for a period of roughly 2 years. The young couple shared a villa in Kuşadası with the 2 victims, but neighbors told investigators that the tenants would regularly engage in contentious shouting matches. While being interviewed by the police, Çetin initially claimed that the 2 victims had been abducted by a gang of men who took them to a nearby forest. However, after a few hours of interrogation, he confessed to committing the killings, and he was arrested on murder charges. The waiter revealed that on the night of the double homicide, he'd pleaded with Graham to allow her daughter to marry him when the woman refused, stating that Shannon was too young for him. He brutally attacked her and Dinsmore in a fit of vengeful rage. Çetin then attempted to be tried in juvenile courts by claiming he was 17 years old, but bone marrow tests confirmed that the waiter was actually aged 22. Following his criminal trial, Çetin was sentenced to life imprisonment. Number 6. Alexandria Seletos. A man was beaten and robbed outside the Drink nightclub in Tampa, Florida, in the early morning hours of February the 16th of 2017. According to local authorities, the victim, who was left unidentified in subsequent reports on the incident, was accosted by 2 assailants who fled the scene in a vehicle belonging to Alexandria Seletos. The latter, who'd reportedly worked at the club as a waitress for about 4 months before being terminated, told the police that her car had been stolen by the 2 men. However, following further investigation into the matter, it was determined that Seletos had freely given her vehicle to the men. Detectives also found that she'd personally instructed them to carry out the violent robbery. For reasons that weren't immediately revealed to the public, the former server was consequently arrested and charged with principal to robbery, principal to kidnapping, and filing a false report. Number 4. Victoria Lynn Bachman. On April the 10th of 2015, Victoria Lynn Bachman was fired from her job as a waitress at the Ozona Blue restaurant in Palm Harbor, Florida, after it was found that she'd been secretly increasing the tips on her customers' checks. According to the affidavit associated with 21-year-old Bachman's arrest, she'd changed the tip amount on 134 checks. During her employment at the establishment, the Pinellas County Police Department detailed how, when inputting her tips into the restaurant's computer system, the young woman would enter a higher amount than the customers had actually written on the bill. The scheme had reportedly resulted in a total of $1,074.15 being fraudulently charged to customers. Bachman faced grand theft charges in connection to the fraud. She was later released from custody on a $2,000 bond, pending the start of her case's legal proceedings. Number 3. Georgina Henshaw. 65-year-old chef Philip Rolfe was found critically injured in his car outside an apartment in the West Midlands region of England in the early hours of July the 7th of 2017. Rolfe, who'd suffered several stab wounds, was rushed to a nearby hospital, where he was ultimately pronounced dead as a result of excessive internal bleeding. The apartment outside of which the car had been parked was determined to have belonged to Georgina Henshaw, a waitress who worked with Rolfe at the Toby Carvery pub and restaurant in Birmingham. The 36-year-old woman was taken to the police station to undergo a line of questioning, during which she reportedly feigned ignorance as to the circumstances surrounding Rolfe's presumed murder.
Georgina? It's the police. Just gonna wait for a van to come round.
Why am I being arrested? Obviously, they need to question you. They can't be on suspicion of what's happened tonight.
What? Nothing's happened.
Okay, and what you may or may not know. I can't ask you any questions, and to be fair, I don't know very much about
Are you telling me
it.
that Phil's dead?
Yes.
Seriously?
That's why.
It's serious?
Yes. Let's not discuss it.
Investigators examined Henshaw's phone records, whereupon it was discovered that during past text conversations with a friend, she'd expressed overwhelming animosity towards the victim, as well as an explicit desire to kill him. In one such message, Henshaw wrote that she was going to lure him to her apartment and beat him with a kosh, also stating that she was set up to commit murder. Henshaw was thus named as the prime suspect in Rolf's killing, and West Midlands police arrested the woman at her home, after which she was formally charged with the murder. The authorities didn't immediately indicate what they'd suspected to have been Henshaw's motive for the crime. However, it was speculated that Rolf had been embroiled in a contentious workplace feud with the waitress that had ultimately escalated to the point of extreme violence. Following a trial at Birmingham Crown Court, Henshaw was sentenced to serve at least 16 years behind bars. Number 2. David Carroll Masoner. Over the course of 3 years, Tennessee man David Carroll Masoner pilfered credit cards from patrons he'd served at the West Knoxville restaurants where he worked. It was reported that the 46-year-old had used his customers' stolen financial information to take out cash for himself and purchase various items including meals and gift cards. In the summer of 2017, however, Masoner unknowingly applied the scheme to a credit card belonging to an employee of the U.S. Attorney's Office. The unnamed woman would regularly check her billing statements and immediately noticed the fraudulent charges. In the wake of her discovery, she canceled her credit card and contacted both state and federal authorities, who were able to identify Masoner as the person behind the financial fraud. Agents with the Tennessee Highway Patrol's Identity Crimes Unit, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the U.S. Secret Service arrested the server, who confessed to his extensive identity theft scheme. It subsequently emerged that Masoner had 27 previous felony convictions on his record, many of which involved credit card fraud. In spite of his criminal history, he'd managed to find employment at Honey Baked Hams, the Bearden Field House, Perro's on the Hill, and Silver Spoon in Knoxville. Masoner ultimately pleaded guilty to 3 counts of identity theft, and he was consequently sentenced to 12 years in prison by a Knox County Criminal Court judge. Number 1. Alberto Sanchez Gomez. In February of 2019, Spanish waiter Alberto Sanchez Gomez fatally strangled his mother following a heated row at their shared Madrid residence. Subsequent reports detailed how after the 68-year-old woman was dead, Sanchez used a carpenter's saw and 2 large kitchen knives to dismember her body into thousands of pieces, which he stored in lunchboxes placed around the apartment. According to The Independent, over the weeks that followed, the 28-year-old server proceeded to consume his mother's mutilated remains, eating some parts raw and others cooked. Local police were eventually notified by a friend of the victims that she hadn't been seen for several weeks. On February the 21st, law enforcement officers were dispatched to Sanchez's home to conduct a welfare check on his mother. When asked if the woman was in the apartment, the server reportedly replied, "Yes, my mother is in here, dead." Sanchez initially described his mother's grisly killing in graphic detail, prompting the police to take him into custody. However, during the murder trial that followed, the man indicated that he'd heard hidden messages when he watched TV that told him to kill his mother. He also maintained that he had no recollection of dismembering the woman's corpse and that he was very repentant for his gruesome actions. The jury ultimately found Sanchez guilty of murder, for which he was sentenced to 15 years in prison plus an additional 5 months for the desecration of a corpse. Number 8. Robert Louis Deere. On November the 27th of 2015, a man opened fire on the occupants of a Planned Parenthood clinic in Colorado Springs, Colorado. After hearing the sound of gunshots, the clinic staff sprang into action and quickly moved people out of the waiting room. They then locked a security door before notifying local police of the active shooter situation. As responding law enforcement units approached the clinic, the gunman fired upon them as well, killing one of the officers and injuring another 5. A standoff subsequently ensued and lasted several hours, over the course of which the police put the surrounding area on lockdown. Shortly before 5 p.m., a group of SWAT officers brought the standoff to a swift conclusion when they crashed an armored truck into the clinic's lobby. Many of those who'd been trapped inside were rescued, and the gunman ultimately surrendered himself to the authorities. During the investigation that followed, the man responsible for the mass shooting was identified as 57-year-old Robert Louis Deere. Aside from the officer's death, his rampage had also ended the lives of civilians Kiare Stewart and Jennifer Markowski. Deere was a drifter from North Carolina who'd allegedly targeted the Planned Parenthood clinic for political reasons. When detectives questioned him about the incident, he went on a rambling rant in which he expressed deeply anti-abortion and anti-government views. He also made concerning statements about then-President Barack Obama that prompted the U.S. Secret Service to interview him as well. After undergoing a series of mental competency evaluations, Deere was deemed both delusional and incompetent to stand trial. The judge presiding over his case ordered him to be confined to a Colorado State mental hospital indefinitely. Number 7. Joshua Odom. A man walked into a police station in Des Moines, Iowa, on August the 11th of 2016 and confessed to committing the murder of an elderly Florida man more than a decade earlier. Detectives spoke with the forthcoming individual, a drifter named Joshua Odom, who proceeded to describe in graphic detail how he'd killed Richard Busey back in 2002. Odom, who was homeless at the time, had met up with 70-year-old Busey on April the 4th of that year. They both ended up going to the man's apartment in Wilton Manors, Florida, to have intimate relations. Later on that night, Odom reportedly decided to rob and kill Busey, planning to use what he took from him to purchase drugs. According to the Sun-Sentinel, Busey's lifeless body was found covered by a sheet on the floor of his living room by a friend who'd gone to check on him. The murder had remained unsolved until Odom's unprompted confession, which the Des Moines police passed on to officials in South Florida. The drifter was ultimately taken into the custody of the Broward County Sheriff's Office on charges of first-degree murder and theft. Number 6. Arturo Perez. Famie Bellot, the owner of a women's apparel store in Mount Vernon, Kentucky, was found dead inside her shop on the evening of September the 29th of 2020. The Rockcastle County coroner conducted an autopsy on the 54-year-old's body and determined that she'd been stabbed to death. In the incident's wake, local schools were placed on heightened alert. On September the 30th, all students were ordered to be kept inside their respective buildings throughout the day. During the ensuing murder investigation, local and state authorities worked in conjunction towards identifying a suspect. In the month that followed the fatal stabbing, it was reported that they'd arrested a person of interest in the case. A Kentucky state trooper announced during a press conference that a 26-year-old drifter named Arturo Perez had walked into the Lexington Metro Police Department and confessed to Bellard's killing. The resulting arrest report detailed how Perez had entered the victim's store and robbed her while brandishing a fake handgun. He then knifed the woman to death before fleeing the scene. Perez was charged with murder, robbery, and tampering with evidence. Number 5. Jacob Barber. On July the 21st of 2019, police officers in Moore, Oklahoma, were sent to the home of local resident Glenn Barber, who had failed to show up to church as he was known to routinely do every Sunday. Upon their arrival at the house, the police discovered the man's body. Barber had been attacked and killed via multiple stab wounds. They also found bloodstains and a bloodied knife in the bedroom, belonging to the victim's son, Jacob. As was later detailed in court documents, the father and son had had a volatile relationship and were said to have gotten into heated arguments on a daily basis. Jacob had reportedly gone to several mental health institutions in the past. Even though he'd been diagnosed with schizophrenia, he allegedly refused to take any medications, which proved to be a point of contention between him and his father. Investigators immediately identified Jacob as the case's prime suspect. However, following his father's killing, the 21-year-old had reportedly fled his hometown and become a drifter, leading to a multi-day manhunt that extended into neighboring states. He was eventually located outside of a PetSmart along US Highway 377 in Roanoke, Texas. Local officers had been responding to a call about a suspicious person when they found Jacob sleeping on his backpack. He was taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder. Number 4. Andrew Charles Altland. York Area Regional Police in Pennsylvania received a tip on August 29th of 2019 about an individual suspected of breaking into and burglarizing multiple local schools. Officers tracked the man, subsequently identified as 23-year-old Andrew Charles Altland, to a barbershop in Queensgate Town Centre. He was taken into custody on charges of burglary, theft, institutional vandalism, and defiant trespass. According to subsequent reports, Altland, a drifter of no fixed address, had gotten into York County School of Technology through an unlocked door on August the 27th. He proceeded to spend much of that night inside the school, allegedly stealing shoes, a t-shirt, and food as he wandered the building, rummaging through closets and desks. Altland then punctuated his trespassing escapade by relieving himself on the floor of the attendance office. It was reportedly the second time in a week that the drifter had broken into a York County school. Spring Gettysburg Township Police also charged Altland for burglarizing the York Suburban Middle School. He was accused of eating, sleeping, and showering inside after breaking a window with a rock to gain access to the building. Following his arrest, Altland's bail was reportedly set at $50,000. Number 3. Michael David Morano. A drifter from Orange County, California, was identified as a suspect in a series of bank robberies that were committed over the course of 2 months in the summer of 2011. A statement released on behalf of the sheriff's office revealed that Michael David Morano, whom the media had dubbed the Drifter Bandit, had been taken into custody by local officials after being pulled over in his vehicle on July the 8th. Morano had allegedly stolen an estimated total of $30,000 from 4 different banks during his robbery spree, which had taken place between May the 3rd and July the 6th. He was tracked down by the Orange County Police's Bank Robbery Apprehension Team, which consisted of a sheriff's deputy and an FBI agent. Morano was reported as having a lengthy criminal record that dated back to the 1980s. In addition to being a career criminal, the 46-year-old was also reportedly a vagabond who roamed Southern California. Following the man's arrest, a spokesman for the Orange County Sheriff's Office quipped that he would now only be drifting from the county jail to the federal penitentiary. In August of 2012, Morano pleaded guilty to 4 counts each of second-degree robbery and second-degree commercial burglary. As part of a plea bargain with prosecutors, the drifter had 8 prior convictions struck from his record, including for 5 robberies and 2 assaults with a firearm, all of which stem from judgment decisions handed down in 1988. Morano was consequently imprisoned for a term of 30 years. Number 2. Sean Laval Smith. At about 1:30 p.m. on January the 13th of 2022, Brianna Kupfer, a design consultant at a Los Angeles furniture shop, sent a text to a friend saying there was a man inside the store who was giving her a bad vibe. Shortly thereafter, a customer walked in to find the 24-year-old's bloodied and lifeless body on the floor. Kupfer, a UCLA graduate student, had been fatally stabbed by the man she deemed suspicious, who subsequently fled out the back door. Within a few hours of the murder, the LAPD used surveillance footage to identify the assailant as Sean Laval Smith, aged 31. The following day, investigators received a tip from a Good Samaritan who'd seen a man matching Smith's description on the corner of Colorado and Fair Oaks in Pasadena. Officers were dispatched to the location where they came upon the suspect at a bus bench and arrested him on the spot without incident. Court documents indicated that Smith had had several run-ins with the law in the past, including a 2016 arrest in South Carolina that had resulted in him being charged with assaulting a police officer. The authorities described Smith, who reportedly had a history of mental illness, as a drifter who used the public transit system to get around Los Angeles. Subsequent reports indicated that he'd had no prior relationship with the victim and that he targeted her in a completely random act of violence. Smith was charged with murder, to which a special allegation that he used a knife as a deadly weapon in the commission of the crime was added. Number 1. Colin Daniel Richards. Shortly before 10:30 a.m. on September the 17th of 2018, the police were called to the Coldwater Golf Links in Ames, Iowa, after a bag had been found unattended on the course. Upon combing through the surrounding area, officers discovered the body of former Iowa State University golf champion Celia Barquin Arozamena. The remains were retrieved from a pond close to where the golf bag had been abandoned. The 22-year-old victim had been killed via multiple stab wounds to her upper torso, head, and neck. The police subsequently encountered a man identified only by the initials DB walking on a nearby trail. He claimed to have been staying with a homeless drifter at a makeshift campsite in a wooded area near the golf course. DB told the investigators that only a few days earlier, the drifter had shared with him that he'd felt a powerful urge to assault and murder someone. Later that afternoon, a canine unit tracked Rotzamena's scent into the woods, where the police came upon Colin Daniel Richards at the campsite DB had previously described. The man had scratches all over his face and was allegedly attempting to conceal a cut on his left hand while speaking with the officers. Richards was found to be in possession of a knife and a black backpack containing 2 pairs of bloodied shorts. It was ultimately determined that he'd fatally stabbed Rotzamena while she'd been golfing alone that morning, and he was arrested on a charge of first-degree murder. In June of 2019, Richards pleaded guilty to the charge and was consequently sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Thanks for watching. Would you rather lead a nomadic existence or never leave your room for an entire year? Let us know in the comments section below.